Hello, once again, RotoBallers. If you don't have what the kids call Riz, I'm here to up your fantasy Riz game and help you pull in those fantasy championships. With that said, here are my starts and sits at the wide receiver and quarterback positions for week number 15. First up, those wide receivers. And starting with DK Metcalf versus the Philadelphia Eagles. If you can score a touchdown with Drew Lock throwing you the ball, you make the start list the following week no matter what. It also helps when you face an Eagles team that is allowing more fantasy points to wide receivers than any other team. Despite being ejected from last week's game against the 49ers, Metcalf has 13 or more fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games, so you have to feel this week's matchup could potentially be his third game of more than 20 fantasy points over the last 5. My second start position this week is a duo from Los Angeles. I know I'm not talking about Batman and Robin here making their Hollywood debut. I'm talking about Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua versus the Washington Commanders. Against a tough Ravens secondary, both Kupp and Nacua each came away with 5 catches, 80 plus yards, and saw 8 targets. Not to mention they both came out with at least 13 fantasy points, with Kupp leading the way with 8 grabs, 115 yards, and a touchdown. Washington, they already have a hard enough time when it comes to covering one wide receiver. I don't think they're going to be able to cover 2 this week. What do you think? This season, the Commanders have allowed 2,580 receiving yards, 20 touchdowns, and if you work that out in fantasy, that works out to 42.27 fantasy points per game. And the third fantasy start here at the wide receiver position, it goes to Zay Flowers versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, who is coming off a back-to-back 20-plus fantasy performances. And then back in that Week 12 game against the Chargers, he would end up with a rushing and a receiving touchdown. Then, last week, he ended up with another touchdown and 60 yards against the Los Angeles Rams. In each of the previous contests, Flowers had 5 or more receptions in each, as well as 8-plus targets. This week, he has a top 5 fantasy matchup against the boys from Duval County, who have allowed more than 41 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position over the last 4 weeks, and 16 total touchdowns to wide receivers this season. Oh yeah, Odell Beckham Jr., he's a solid flex this week, and always start Michael Pittman. As for players you're not starting, it starts with Marquise Brown versus the San Francisco 49ers. I'm going to try some reverse psychology here, the old reverse jinx, because something has to give at this point for Marquise Hollywood Brown to finally do something with Kyler Murray. The 49ers are inside the top 10 when it comes to allowing fantasy production to wide receivers this season, allowing more than 37.5 fantasy points per game, and they've allowed just under 2,200 receiving yards. Then again, at some point, you are what you are, and Brown has failed to produce double-digit fantasy production in 6 of his last 8 games, and he has not gone over 16 fantasy points since way back in week number 5. Brown, he's been dealing that heel injury the last few weeks, but right now, he's more of a heel than he is a baby face, and after the bye, he's saying he feels better, but heading into this NFC divisional battle, I have my doubts. Now, my number 2 wide receiver that I'm sitting this week, it's Calvin Ridley versus the Baltimore Ravens. Many were surprised to see the Rams take advantage of this Ravens secondary a week ago, but one thing that we know about Matthew Stafford is he always beats the blitz. With no Christian Kirk to take some of that attention away from Ridley this week, and a quarterback who's on one leg facing a Ravens team that leads the league in sacks, the opportunity to produce for Ridley takes a huge hit this week. Expect the targets to be there once again. Heck, he saw 13 of them just a week ago. However, he only caught 5 of those 13 targets for 53 yards. Opportunities, they're going to be there. But between the Ravens defense looking to rebound a quarterback at less than 100%, I'm fading Ridley this week. And my third fade at the wide receiver position is Keenan Allen, Thursday Night Football versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Justin Herbert was lost last week to an injury there, and Easton Stick now will step under center there with Max Crosby lining across from him on the other side of the field. Once Herbert left last week's contest, so did Keenan Allen's fantasy managers' hopes and dreams. And still, he had 6 catches for 68 yards, but this Chargers offense really had nothing going for it. The Raiders defense is playing much better under Antonio Pierce. They are the 10th stingiest defense against opposing wide receivers, allowing 30.77 per game this season. And if you want a little bit of a sample size, back in week 4, Allen was held to a season low in receptions, targets, and yards as the Raiders held him to 3 catches for 32. As for the quarterbacks you're starting here in week number 15, here we go! Starting with Matthew Stafford versus the Washington Commanders. The Commanders are going to have their hands full this week. Stafford is coming into this contest having just thrown for 294 yards and 3 touchdowns against one of the best pass defenses in the entire league. Washington, they're one of the worst in the league, not only in fantasy, but in the NFL. They're allowing 266 yards passing per game and 24.5 passing points per game to the quarterback position, and I don't see how they're going to match up with Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, Kyren Williams, and this Rams offense. Williams, he's the one who brings this offense together. Since his return 3 weeks ago, Stafford has thrown 10 touchdowns and posted 23 or more fantasy points in each of those games. My second start of the week is Russell Wilson versus the Detroit Lions. Wilson had a very respectable 18 fantasy points last week against the Chargers. Over the last 4 weeks, I won't say that he's been cooking, but he has attempted the 6th most passes inside the red zone. He has produced 16 or more fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 outings. He is also QB 13 in fantasy, throwing 23 touchdowns to only 8 interceptions. This week, Wilson faces the Lions team allowing more than 25 fantasy points per game and just had Justin Fields throw for 223 yards, run for 58, and contributed to 2 scores and 25 fantasy points. One thing is all but guaranteed here, and that is that Wilson to Sutton in the end zone, which has happened in 7 of the last 8 games. And finally, the third start of the week, maybe a little bit of a sleeper here, is Jake Browning versus the Minnesota Vikings. Jake Frost has his Bengals team nipping at the playoffs after throwing for 374 yards against the Jaguars. He followed that up with a 275-yard performance against the Colts last week. In his first 3 starts, Browning's 79.3 completion percentage is the highest completion percentage by a quarterback in his first 3 starts dating back to 1950, which has gone a long ways towards his 50 fantasy points in which he's produced over the last 2 weeks. In today's quarterback economy, if you can get 16 fantasy points from your quarterback and he remains healthy, that's a win right there. As for quarterbacks who are not going to win you this week, it starts with Miami Dolphins signal caller Tua Tagovailoa versus the New York Jets. After watching what this Titans team did to the Miami Dolphins last week, they're on Monday Night Football, we have to have concern. Especially if Tyreek Hill is less than 100% this week, then I'm going to give this Jets defense an advantage over this high-octane Dolphins offense. New York has allowed 762 passing yards, which is less than 200 yards per game, and 6 passing touchdowns over the last 4 weeks, but they also have 4 interceptions, and they're holding opposing signal callers under 12 fantasy points. That's not good if you're a Tua Tagovailoa manager. Now, the second quarterback is Trevor Lawrence versus the Baltimore Ravens. I'll make this quick. I already explained much of the reason why I'm down on Trevor Lawrence when I was talking about Calvin Ridley this week. And Lawrence, he's going to come into this one less than 100%. He threw 3 picks last week against a very good Browns defense there, and Baltimore comes in this game leading the league with 49 sacks and have more interceptions, 11, than touchdowns allowed, 10. My third quarterback sit this week is Kyler Murray versus the San Francisco 49ers. The 49ers, they're allowing less than 13 fantasy points per game this season to quarterbacks and fewer than 12 over the last 4 weeks. And that includes a 25-point performance from Jalen Hurts in week number 13. Also, the 49ers have twice as many interceptions as they have passing touchdowns allowed over that time. Neither Murray nor his weapons are going to be confused with this Eagles offense, so this is going to be a long day for this Cardinals team. With that all being said, once again, just a reminder that this video is being recorded on Monday, so plenty can happen between now and Sunday's kickoffs. So check out RotoBaller.com and the RotoBaller Discord channel for all the latest fantasy football news. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you are subscribed for all your fantasy football analysis.